The bitter winter wind stripped the elm trees bare, but the truest chill lingered inside the quiet town mercantile. 10-year-old Nelly stared at her boots. She wished the frayed hem of her oversized, faded gray dress would simply swallow her whole. Then came the laughter. "Really, Harriet? It looks as though she's wearing a potato sack left out in the rain." "Nelly, sweetheart, don't mind them. Let's go home." It was polite, mocking, and cruel, echoing from the wealthy women gathered by the counter. They assumed their arrogance would go completely unchecked. They were wrong. Standing quietly in the shadows was Josiah Langden, a millionaire cattleman. He heard them laugh at the widow's daughter's old dress. Josiah didn't raise his voice or make a scene, but his very next move would silence everyone in that frontier town. If a story like this one, where quiet dignity gets the reckoning it's owed, is the kind that pulls you in, stay with me for a moment before we step back into it. Tap that like button if you're already invested, subscribe if you'd like more of these to find their way to you, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every one. Now let's step back into 1883. Winter arrived in Clearwater with a bitter wind that stripped the elm trees bare. It was November of 1883. The cold seeped through the wooden floorboards of the town mercantile and settled deep into the bones of anyone who lingered. Cora Thornton stood near the counter, counting small coins into her palm. She was a widow. Her hands were red from washing clothes in freezing water, and her back ached from carrying firewood. Beside her stood her daughter, Nelly. Nelly was 10 years old. She had bright blonde hair that fell in thick, neat braids down her back. She was a quiet girl. She had learned to be quiet the day her father did not come home from the lumber camp. Nelly was wearing a gray woolen dress. It was not her dress. It had belonged to a neighbor's older girl 3 years ago. The wool was thinning at the elbows. The hem had been taken up, then let down again, leaving a faint, jagged line of darker gray near her ankles. The collar was fastened with a mismatched iron button. Cora knew the dress was poor. Nelly knew it too, but they did not complain. They were Thorntons. Nelly's grandfather had been Colonel Silas Thornton. During the Civil War, the colonel had led the legendary midnight charge at Antietam. He had taken 100 men through the dark to secure the vital stone bridge, holding off an entire battalion until dawn. He was a hero. The town had built a small wooden plaque near the bank in his honor. But bronze plaques and Old Glory did not buy flour. They did not patch a leaking roof. When the colonel died 5 years ago, he left behind a proud name and a heavily mortgaged farm. Cora's husband had tried to save it. When he passed, the weight of the dirt and debt fell entirely on Cora. She placed her coins on the glass counter. "Half a sack of oats, Mr. Higgins," Cora said softly, "and a tin of lard." Mr. Higgins nodded. He was a decent man, but business was business. He swept the coins into his till. Nelly stood near the fabric display. Her blue eyes were fixed on a bolt of bright red flannel. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It looked warm. It looked like Christmas. She reached out one cold, bare hand and let her fingers hover just an inch above the soft cloth. She did not touch it. Her mother had taught her never to handle things they could not afford to buy. Behind her, the mercantile door opened. A rush of cold wind swept into the room, followed by the rustle of heavy silk. Mrs. Harriet Gable and Mrs. Eunice Croft walked in. They were the wives of the town's 2 most prosperous merchants. They wore thick fur collars. Their hats were pinned with dyed feathers. Nelly took a step back, making room for them. Mrs. Gable brushed past. She stopped at the fabric counter. She noticed the red flannel. Then she noticed the little blonde girl standing near it. Her eyes moved down. They swept over Nelly's mismatched button. They lingered at the worn elbows. They stopped at the jagged, faded hem of the oversized gray dress. Mrs. Gable smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Beautiful fabric, isn't it?" Mrs. Gable said. Nelly looked up. "Yes, ma'am." "It's imported," Mrs. Croft added, stepping closer. $4 a yard. I'm having a winter coat made of it for my niece." Nelly nodded politely. She pulled her hands behind her back. Mrs. Gable let out a low, breathless chuckle. "It is certainly no fabric for a farm girl, though. Looking at you, child, I suppose any fabric at all would be an improvement." Mrs. Croft covered her mouth. She let out a sharp, piercing laugh. The sound echoed off the tin ceiling. "Really, Harriet, it looks as though she's wearing a potato sack left out in the rain. You would think the granddaughter of a war hero would have a shred of dignity." "Pride doesn't keep you warm, Eunice, but neither does that dreadful garment." They laughed again. Nelly did not cry. She simply lowered her head. Her shoulders tightened. She stared at the floorboards, wishing the wood would open up and hide her. At the counter, Cora stiffened. Her hands gripped the edge of the wood. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She took a slow, deep breath, swallowing the sharp retort that burned in her throat. She could not afford to anger the wives of the men who bought her eggs and milk. "Nelly," Cora said. Her voice was steady, but it carried a slight tremble. "Come here, please." Nelly hurried to her mother's side. "We are leaving," Cora said. She picked up her small sack of oats. She took Nelly's hand. They walked past the two women without looking up, pushing through the heavy mercantile doors and stepping out into the freezing wind. They did not notice the tall man standing just inside the entryway. Josiah Langden had stepped out of the shadows near the stove. He was a cattleman. He owned the sprawling Broken Ridge Ranch 20 miles out of town. He employed 40 men. He shipped cattle on the new railroad all the way to Chicago. He was, by every measure, a millionaire. But he did not dress like one. He wore a faded canvas coat, heavy leather chaps, and a wide-brimmed hat dusted with trail dirt. Josiah had heard every word. He had seen the little blonde girl looking at the red flannel. He had seen the way the women looked at her. He had heard the laughter. Josiah knew that sound. He had a daughter of his own. Her name was Eliza. She was 9 years old. Since Josiah's wife passed away, Eliza was his entire world. If anyone ever looked at his Eliza the way those women had just looked at the Thornton girl, Josiah wasn't certain what he'd do. But Cora Thornton had not shouted. She had simply absorbed the blow to protect her daughter. Josiah watched the widow and the little girl disappear down the frozen, rutted street. He slowly turned his head and looked at Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Croft. They were still chuckling, admiring the red flannel. Josiah walked up to the fabric counter. His boots struck the floorboards with heavy, deliberate thuds. The sound was loud enough for both women to turn around. Mrs. Gable's smile faltered. She recognized him. Everyone in Clearwater recognized Josiah Langden. "Mr. Langden," Mrs. Gable said, smoothing her silk skirt. "A cold morning, isn't it?" Josiah did not smile. He looked at the red flannel. Then he looked at Mrs. Gable. "Mr. Higgins." His voice was deep. It rumbled like distant thunder. The storekeeper hurried over. "Yes, Mr. Langden. What can I do for you?" Josiah pointed a thick, leather-gloved finger at the red flannel. "How many yards do you have on that bolt?" "About 40 yards, sir." "I'll take it." Mrs. Gable blinked. "But, Mr. Langden, I was just about to purchase 5 yards for my niece." Josiah finally looked directly into Mrs. Gable's eyes. His gaze was entirely flat. It lacked any warmth. "You were, but you were too busy laughing to open your purse." Mrs. Gable's face flushed a deep mottled red. Josiah pulled a thick roll of greenbacks from his coat pocket. He peeled off several bills and dropped them onto the counter. "Wrap the whole bolt, Mr. Higgins, and load it into my wagon." Josiah turned and walked out the door, leaving the mercantile in absolute silence. He stepped out into the cold. He looked down the street. He could still see Cora and Nelly walking in the distance, their heads bowed against the wind. Josiah did not follow them immediately. He was not a man who acted recklessly. He was a man who planned. He untied his horse from the hitching post. He had come to town to sign the Northern Line's grazing contracts, the railroad's first real reach into this valley, and a good deal of Josiah's own money already sunk into seeing the tracks laid right. But as he mounted his horse, he realized the contracts could wait a while longer. Something else required his attention first. The Clearwater Bank sat at the end of the street, built of red brick and thick glass. It was the warmest building in town. Josiah pushed open the heavy oak doors. The warmth washed over him, smelling of pipe tobacco and polished wood. Behind the main desk sat Mr. Arthur Gable. He was a man who preferred ledgers to people. He was also the husband of Harriet Gable. Mr. Gable looked up from his papers. His polite, practiced smile appeared instantly. "Mr. Langden, I have the grazing contracts ready for your signature." Josiah walked to the desk. He did not sit down. "I'm not here for the contracts." Gable's lip slipped just a fraction. "Is there a problem with the terms?" "No." Josiah rested his large, calloused hands on the polished mahogany. "I want to see the Thornton note." The bank manager froze. The silence in the room stretched. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly. "The Thornton note," Gable repeated. His voice had lost its confident rhythm. "I'm afraid I cannot discuss another customer's private accounts, Mr. Langdon. It's a matter of bank policy." Josiah stared at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply let the weight of his presence fill the space between them. Josiah was a man half the ranchers in the county kept their money with, not out of loyalty, but because his cattle contracts alone moved more silver through this bank than any 3 other accounts combined. "Show me the ledger, Arthur." Gable swallowed hard. He pulled a heavy drawer. He pulled a leather-bound book and slid it across the desk. Josiah looked at the numbers. The original loan had been for $200, taken out by Cora's late husband, to buy seed and repair the barn. The balance at the bottom of the page was nearly $450. Josiah's eyes narrowed. He traced a finger down the column of ink. "What are these charges?" "Standard interest," Gable said quickly, "and late penalties. Mrs. Thornton has missed the full payment amount 3 times. The bank must protect its investments." "She missed 1 payment by $3. Josiah read the entry again. "And you added a $20 penalty." "It is standard practice." Gable stiffened. "The bank cannot afford to be sentimental, Mr. Langdon. If a property cannot sustain itself, the bank must take it back." Josiah closed the ledger. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. He understood now. This wasn't about a $3 shortage. This was about the farm. The Thornton property sat on a prime section of the valley, right where the new county road and the railroad's survey line was expected to cross. Gable didn't want Cora's money. He wanted her land. What Josiah didn't yet know was how badly Gable needed it. The bank's own reserves had thinned over a hard 2 years of loans gone bad across the county, and Gable had quietly borrowed against his own house to cover a shortfall his examiners hadn't yet got. A foreclosed farm sold fast to a land speculator ahead of the railroad's announcement was the fastest way Gable knew to make that hole disappear before anyone in St. Louis came asking questions. It didn't excuse him, but it meant he wasn't laughing while he did it. Josiah reached into his coat. He pulled out the same thick roll of greenbacks. He counted out $450 and dropped the bills onto the ledger. "The debt is paid." Gable stared at the money. "Mr. Langdon, you cannot simply—" "I just did." Josiah's voice didn't rise. "Write the receipt, Arthur." Gable picked up his pen. His hand shook slightly as he wrote out the confirmation. He stamped it and handed the paper across the desk. Josiah folded it and placed it in his pocket. Before he turned away, Josiah leaned closer. "If I ever hear of you adding false penalties to a working family's account again," he said, his voice a low rumble, I will pull every dollar of the Broken Ridge accounts out of your vault, and I will tell every rancher in this valley to do the same." Gable turned completely pale. 2 miles outside of town, the Thornton farmhouse sat against a line of dark pines. The front porch sagged on the left side, but the yard was neatly swept and firewood was stacked in careful, straight lines against the wall. Inside, Cora sat at the kitchen table mending Nelly's gray dress with black thread because she'd run out of gray. Nelly sat on the braided rug near the small iron stove, reading a schoolbook. "Ma, did Grandpa Silas really hold the bridge all by himself?" Cora stopped sewing. "No, he wasn't by himself. He had good men with him." Nelly turned a page. "Mrs. Gable said pride doesn't keep you warm." Cora felt a sudden ache in her chest. "Mrs. Gable is right about that. She's wrong about everything else, though." "What do you mean?" "Pride doesn't keep you warm," Cora said, her voice steady, "but dignity keeps you standing. A person can have cold hands and still have a strong spine. Do you understand?" Nelly thought about it. She nodded slowly. "I don't mind the dress, Ma." It was a lie. They both knew it, but it was a brave lie, offered out of love. A dog barked outside. Cora stood, looked through the frosted window. A heavy wagon pulled by 2 dark horses was rolling into their yard. Josiah climbed down, helped 9-year-old Eliza to the ground, and lifted the massive bolt of red flannel from the wagon bed. "Mr. Langdon," Cora said from the porch, her voice guarded. "Mrs. Thornton, I apologize for the intrusion. I heard the conversation in the store this morning. I heard what was said to your daughter." Nelly shrank back a little. "I bought this fabric because I refused to let Harriet Gable have it, but I have no use for 40 yards of flannel. My ranch hands don't want it, and my daughter says red isn't her color." Eliza nodded solemnly. "It clashes with my boots." "I need someone to turn this into winter shirts for my men," Josiah said. "I hear you're the finest seamstress this side of the Ridge. I'd like to hire you at fair wages." Cora stared at the cloth. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was offering her money without offering her shame. "And," Josiah added, his voice dropping slightly, "I'd ask that you use the first few yards to make a dress for your daughter. Consider it a signing bonus." Cora's breath hitched. Nelly was staring at the fabric like she was looking at a fire on a freezing night. "Why are you doing this?" Cora asked softly. "Because a town that laughs at a child," Josiah said, "is a town that needs to be reminded of its manners." He handed her the folded receipt from the bank. "That's the note, paid in full." Cora unfolded it, saw the stamp, saw the numbers. Her hands began to shake. "Mr. Langdon, this is $450. "Listen to me carefully," Josiah interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp. "Arthur Gable was adding false penalties to your loan to force a default. He wants this farm. The railroad's final survey crosses your creek. If Gable can take your land before that survey files, he can sell it to the line at a premium instead of losing it to a right-of-way payment." Cora looked toward the creek. A cold dread settled in her stomach. "Have you had visitors lately? Men with tools near the water?" "Last week. 2 men near the ridge. When I walked out with my rifle, they rode off. I thought they were lost." "Men like that are never lost." Josiah's jaw tightened. "Lock your doors tonight, Mrs. Thornton. Gable just lost his leverage at the bank. Men like him don't give up when there's a fortune on the line. He'll try something faster and messier." That night, the wind rattled down the chimney, but the kitchen felt warm. Cora's shears cut through the heavy red flannel with a soft, expensive sound. Nelly, supposed to be asleep, sat up in her cot watching her mother work. "Ma," Nelly whispered, "is Mr. Langdon going to shoot Mr. Gable?" Cora stopped sewing. "No, good men don't shoot people over money. Grandpa Silas shot people. That was a war. This is a valley." Cora threaded her needle again. Besides, I suspect Mr. Langdon knows worse things to do to a banker than shoot him. By 3 in the morning, the dress was finished. Cora held it up. It was perfect. She did not go to bed. She walked to the corner cabinet, pulled out her husband's Winchester rifle, and loaded the magazine in the dark. She sat in the rocking chair facing the window, rifle across her lap, and waited. An hour passed. Then the dog barked, sharp, frantic. Down by the creek, near the old stone boundary marker, 2 lanterns swung in the dark. Men were on her land, not walking toward the house, but toward the water itself. One carried heavy timbers, the other carried tools for driving posts into the creek bed. Cora understood instantly. They weren't there to move a marker, they were building a diversion, a rough dam and intake gate, enough to redirect the flow toward a channel that ran clear of Thornton land before the county surveyor's report ever named who the water legally belonged to. If the diversion was already built and running by morning, undoing it would mean a lawsuit Cora couldn't afford to file against a bank that could afford to stall it for years. She opened the front door. The freezing air hit her face. She raised the rifle and pulled the hammer back. "Step away from the water." The lanterns stopped moving. The 2 men turned toward the house. "Go back inside, lady," a gruff voice called back. "County business. This is private land, and you're trespassing." The man laughed, a dirty, cruel sound. "Ha, not anymore, it ain't. Bank says the survey's coming in wrong. We're just fixing the flow before anybody argues about it." He hefted a timber toward the creek bed. Cora aimed the rifle slightly above his head and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot shattered the quiet night. The bullet struck a pine branch above him and the 2 men. Snow showered down over both men's hats. The man dropped the timber. The other drew a revolver. "Are you crazy?" "The next one goes lower," Cora said. Her hands were shaking, but the barrel did not waver. The man raised his revolver toward the porch. Before he could fire, horsebeats tore through the trees. 4 riders erupted into the moonlight. No lanterns, just ropes and rifles. At the front rode Josiah Langden, driving his horse straight between the 2 men in the creek. His foreman Amos uncoiled a lariat and dropped it neatly over the armed man, jerking him backward into the snow. Josiah reined to a halt. "Put the timber back where you found it," he said to the first man, quiet. "Now walk back to town. If you stop before you reach the bank, Amos will drag you the rest of the way." The 2 men scrambled off, leaving their lanterns in the snow. Josiah rode up to the porch. Cora stood there, rifle still smoking slightly. "I told you to lock your doors, Mrs. Thornton," he said mildly. "I did, but they were outside." A small smile tugged at Josiah's mouth. "Colonel Silas would have been proud of that shot." "Did you know they were coming?" "I suspected Gable was cornered enough to try something ugly. Cowards do their dirty work in the dark." He dismounted. "The railroad's final surveyors files his report at the courthouse this morning. Gable needed that water moved before then, or the report names you as the senior right holder, and his whole plan dies on paper." "What happens now?" Josiah looked toward town. "Now the sun comes up, and we go see the banker. I won't pretend I know for certain those 2 will say a word against him in daylight. Men who'll build an illegal dam at midnight aren't always brave enough to confess to it by breakfast, but it's the only card we've got, so we're playing it." Morning broke clear and bright. The mercantile was already busy. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Croft stood near the stove, gossiping about the winter social, unaware of what had happened in the dark. Arthur Gable sat at his desk, drinking tea, glancing at the window, waiting for word that the water had been moved. Instead, he saw a heavy wagon rolling down Main Street, Josiah driving, Cora beside him, 6 Broken Ridge hands riding behind. The wagon stopped in front of the bank. The town grew quiet. Josiah helped Cora down, then Nelly climbed out of the back, and he lifted her gently to the ground. A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. Nelly was not wearing the frayed gray wool. She wore a new dress of deep, brilliant flannel velvet at the cuffs, collar high and neat. She looked warm. She looked proud. Mrs. Gable, standing on the boardwalk, dropped her purse. She recognized the fabric immediately. Nelly held her mother's hand and looked straight ahead. They pushed open the bank's heavy oak doors. Gable stood, his face the color of old parchment, looking at 6 ranch hands, then at Cora's steady gaze, then at Josiah. "Mr. Langdon," Gable said, his voice thin, "you cannot bring armed men into a bank." "They're not armed." Josiah gestured. "The men open their coats, not a gun belt among them. They're witnesses, and they have a story to tell." "I have no time for stories," Gable said, adjusting his spectacles with a trembling hand. "I'm running a business." "You were running a business. Now you're running out of time." He laid a signed confession on the desk. The 2 men from the creek, persuaded overnight that a long walk in the snow with Amos wasn't worth their silence. Gable's eyes darted to the door. "This proves nothing. Men will sign anything when they're frightened. The railroad needs that water. If Mrs. Thornton won't sell, the county will find a way. Even you can't fight progress, Mr. Langdon." "Who do you think is paying for the new tracks, Arthur?" The room went silent. "The Northern Line," Josiah said, "is a very expensive project. The steel comes from Pennsylvania. The timber comes from Oregon. The money comes from me." Gable sank back into his chair. He had spent months trying to steal land for a company Josiah already owned, trying to sell Josiah's own water back to him. Josiah's voice carried a note of genuine, tired pity. "You thought you were being clever. You thought a fast foreclosure and a quiet sale would cover whatever hole you've dug yourself into at this bank. I don't know what that hole is, Arthur, and I find I don't much care. You put a widow's daughter's home on the table to fill it." He turned and handed Cora a heavy document with a legal seal. "Mrs. Thornton, this is a 10-year lease. The Northern Line would like to pay you $600 a year for the right to run a water line from your creek to the new station." Cora's hands shook. $600 a year was a fortune. "Say yes," Josiah said. "Yes." Josiah turned back to Gable. "I'm withdrawing all Broken Ridge funds from this institution, every penny, unless you resign and leave Clearwater by sundown." Gable looked around the room for a friendly face. He found none. Even Mr. Higgins turned his back. Josiah offered Cora his arm. "Shall we, Mrs. Thornton?" "We shall." They walked toward the exit. Near the door stood Harriet Gable, pale, the cruel sneer gone, replaced by the realization that her husband was disgraced and their comfort had been standing on nothing solid at all. She looked at Cora, then at Nelly, standing tall in her red flannel dress. Mrs. Gable opened her mouth. No words came out. Nelly did not gloat. She offered a polite, practiced nod and walked out into the bright winter sunlight. By spring, the snow melted from the valley. The railroad laid tracks across the ridge. True to his word, Josiah's men ran the water line carefully, leaving Cora's pastures pristine. Arthur and Harriet Gable left town before the first thaw. No one missed them. Cora kept her farm. She hired 2 men to repair the porch and fix the roof. She also kept sewing the winter shirts for Josiah's men, refusing extra payment for them. A matter of pride. Josiah visited often, sitting on the repaired porch with hot coffee while Eliza and Nelly ran through the tall spring grass. He never spoke of the debt again. They simply sat together, 2 people who understood the value of quiet strength. Years later, Nelly Thornton grew into a fine, educated young woman. She traveled to the city. She wore silk and lace. She never wanted for anything again. But she never forgot the cold afternoon in the mercantile. She never forgot the sound of cruel laughter. And she never forgot the tall cowboy who stood in the shadows and refused to let the cruelty stand. When Nelly packed her trunk for college, she brought her grandfather's faded parchment, a photograph of her mother, and, folded neatly at the very bottom of the trunk, a small frayed scrap of gray wool. She kept it to remember a simple truth. I hope this trip back to 1883 gave you a chance to step out of your everyday routine and drifting to a tale of quiet dignity. I'd love to know how you tuned in today. Sipping coffee, relaxing on the porch, winding down for the evening? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Tell me, did you see Josiah's railroad twist coming? And let me know what part of the world you're watching from. Hitting like and subscribing makes a real difference. Thank you for spending this time with me.